Well, hello again and welcome to the October edition of the Atumos webinar series. I'm your host today, Rusty Hall, account executive here with Atumos. I hope everybody's got their audio figured out. We were going to have a great presentation today. We've got a great topic today for anyone who has struggled with the limitations of data manipulation within Marketo. We've all run into this from time to time as practitioners over the years. Maybe you've needed to normalize a name field. You've got a need to sum up scores from your score fields on product scores. Maybe somebody just fat-fingered an email domain and we want to normalize those email domains. And Marketo out of the box just can't do that. It's functionality that you would think this powerful tool that we're all used to would have the abilities to do that. But there's some limitations that you just can't do, and you need a more powerful solution in your flow steps. So what do you do when you don't have the right solution in your flow steps? You build it. So that's why today we're going to be talking about FlowBoost. It's the flow step that we wish Marketo had out of the box. It didn't, so we built it. And today we're lucky because we have the creator and the brains behind FlowBoost, Sanford Whiteman. I'm sure you've seen him on Community. I'm sure you've seen some of his presentations before through MobsCon. He's very active in the Marketo community, a great innovator for Marketo processes. And today we've got him here with us to talk about FlowBoost. And we're going to do a deep dive on what's possible with FlowBoost and his expertise. So just a few housekeeping things before we get rolling here. I'm going to say, we are in a virtual environment. So if we do have any problems with audio or visuals, please pop that in the QA. We'll address that as quickly as possible and continue rolling. Also, we will have a Q&A at the end of this. So hold your questions for the end of the Q&A. We'll get to those as time allows. So what we're talking about today, what is FlowBoost and why do I care? I think is probably the first most pertinent topic. We'll examine, cool, but what can I actually do with FlowBoost? We'll look at some live examples that Sandy's actually going to do on the fly. So it's not just slideware, folks. It's live examples and a demo. So that's awesome. We're going to also talk about where you can try it out for yourself. There is a community edition available. And we also are going to have a follow-up webinar after you've seen all the cool features that FlowBoost has, what you can do with it. We're going to actually have a follow-up to this after you've gotten free community edition and show you how to do a deeper dive setup into that. All that being said, I'd like to turn it over now to Sanford Whiteman, who is going to be our presenter for the day, and he's going to take us in depth and show you what all is possible. So Sandy, I'm going to make you host real quick here, and you can take it away.
Great, thanks. But hello, thank you all for attending. I wish we could look at each other in person. I know a lot of people still, after many years, kind of wonder what I look like, but I wonder what you guys look like too. So today's going to be, for my standards, very short in terms of slides and long on the live practitioner examples. As Rusty said, we're going to go straight into one instance we're going to use for some demos. And that's going to be kind of nerve-wracking for me because, as you know, when you do a live demo and drag and drop, and especially dealing with, well, Marketo, there could be some problems. It's great that today I've already seen in one of the Slack channels people going, is your SJ down? And I'm like, oh no, that's where I'm doing the demo. But it looks like it's okay. At least the screen was refreshing okay when I rechecked it a little while ago. So if any of you saw my MobsCon presentation, I sometimes do many, many slides. I think I went like to 52 minutes and like 50 slides or something crazy like that. So for me today, there are only about 11 slides or something like that. Get through a few of them. Break, go into the instance, show you some live things, what FlowBoost has always meant. You might have seen it mentioned in a lot of different discussions and even community threads back in the day when we could promote our own products. I mean, this is talking about 4 years ago. I might have mentioned it a few times. The reason that it sort of slid out of sight is, I would say, primarily because of that. Even though I'm a community moderator, you see me all the time on the Marketo community. I do, strictly obey those ethical things. So I'm glad that you guys had the ability to join today and jump out of that box a little bit and learn about it. Because although it does have an incredibly extensive and awesome community edition, which means you don't necessarily have to pay for it at all. It is technically my own product, so I can't talk about it anywhere. So yeah, I'll walk through the inspiration for FlowBoost for a few minutes. I'm already kind of going over the time for this, right? I'll walk through the inspiration for FlowBoost for a few minutes, walk right in, jump back into a couple of slides about one of the sort of like, I don't want to say higher end, but like a little more special features of FlowBoost for a couple of slides and then go back in. And hopefully by the end, like Rusty said, we'll have 15 minutes of Q&A. And we've purposely decided that on November 10th, we're going to have another wider session. That'll be definitely like a, Q&A session with I hope lots of you guys, decide to sign up and get your community keys at the end of this, and then you'll have, 14 days or something, or 12 days to play with them, see what you think, and then we can come back and regroup and talk about your own direct experiences. So without further ado, let's see if I can get all this sharing stuff with the slides and this stuff. This should be kind of fun. So I am going to start my prez. Whoa, already losing sight of it. Sorry. Yikes. I apologize. Too many tabs and whoa. And here we go. Anyone, raise your hand if you can't see the slides at some point. I am going to share my whole screen. In fact, I'm going to take that risk and share my whole screen. So again, definitely raise your hand. Lindsay, Rusty, others are listening in.
For sure.
So, Rusty, any problems? Any tech problems on the back end, or?
Nope, we got you.
Okay, awesome, great. All right, we call it the flow step Marketo forgot, which I think is a good moniker for it because it's something that I've dreamed of having within the product ever since I started using Marketo, which is 2014. So I'll tell you a little bit about the origin story. My origin story you might have already heard of how I got into Marketo, but the origin story of how I started thinking about FlowBoost, perhaps slightly different. So in 2014, a longtime client of mine brought me on to troubleshoot Munchkin. I had never heard of Munchkin before. You can imagine that's a weird entry point into Marketo, but luckily they had time and desperation and interest to have me learn Marketo via the most technical, or one of the most technical sides of Marketo. So figuring out what was going on with Munchkin, it turned out there was a broken beta edition, by the way, was really interesting for me because it also made me think about Marketo from a developer standpoint. I had been a developer for a frightening number of years before that, doing Java, even C++, JavaScript, PHP, and so on, and also had been very experienced with like in-house marketing automation / CRM tools, but really not that familiar at all with the SaaS side of things. When you have an app, even a commercial, or what we used to call a shrink wrap app in-house, you often still get direct access to the back-end database, right? So if you've ever run on-premises CRMs or MA tools or anything like that at your companies, you know that usually the SQL back-end, like SQL Server or Oracle or MySQL or whatever, and like if you have a good developer and if it doesn't break the front end, you can go in and you can build triggers, and all manner of other functions can be called that are part of that database engine itself, right? So like we used to use ACT or something like that, CRM, and the back end of SQL Server. So when ACT couldn't do anything, and after we had tested extensively, we could go in, couldn't do a certain function, we could go into the back end, write a SQL trigger, and at least crossing our fingers, hope that we could do the same thing. Working with a SaaS app like Marketo was sort of shocking to me, a little bit of a shock to the system, because I really like to know what's happening on the back end. I was a database architect, developer, blah, 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 web performance person before I started using these things. So I was like, please let me at least do these things. I know that I can't get to the back end, and that's cool. That's what SaaS is all about. I don't expect to have direct access to MySQL. That's pretty crazy. And when people ask why we don't have it, I now, some 5 years later go, but that's ridiculous. Of course we wouldn't have direct access to the tables. But when I first started out, I was like, I really wish that I could call these MySQL functions, knowing they were using MySQL on the back end. So I started building out flows. Well, first I learned Munchkin and how it works and how it's supposed to work, and then started dipping into velocity. And the first mistake I made was thinking, and most of y'all know that I'm like a velocity expert now, but at the beginning I wasn't quite aware that velocity can't change things permanently on Marketo lead or company fields. It can do really great stuff with output in an email, but the underlying fields remain the same. And that obviously means you're only filling in one tiny piece of the puzzle, and often not enough at all, because you can't work on those manipulated values within flows. You can't sync those manipulated values over to your CRM, and so on. But if I think back where I was in 2014, 2015, I was like, oh, velocity, that's fine. It's a Java dialect. I can write all these, I can convert anything. And then realizing, wait, no, it only changes it in the email, right? It doesn't actually change it in the database. So I started fantasizing about something like the slide that you see here. What if I could run a function? What if I could just put last name, choose last name. This is like an artist reenactment, right? Choose last name from a dropdown, and then choose convert to uppercase and uppercase it. And started like, it's really amazing. That's not like that's not a flow step I haven't found in the tree. It really doesn't exist. And then I sort of widened my scope of, I was like, well, I mean, why have it be a drop down of like just commonly used functions? Why not have it be some sort of code you could write, in whatever dialect or scripting language or whatever, and write it in the text box. So here is like a sort of artist reenactment again of what I was starting to imagine, typing like lead last name to uppercase, so setting the last name to the uppercase version of the last name, right? And yet, of course, that doesn't exist in the flow step as well. So it's like, am I going to have to give up? I don't like giving up on things like this. Again, sometimes with SAS you do have to give up, but luckily I was able to get something working, which we'll see in a few moments. And I also started even thinking a little bigger than that, and like, why should it really just be operating on one field at a time? In theory, and I'm not saying that you all out there might want to do this, but in theory, why not have it operate on multiple fields at the same time? In fact, taking multiple field values into consideration when deciding on the value of a third field makes sense, right? Based on score X and score Y, set the heat field to some grade or something like that. So you're sort of always thinking about multiple considerations anyway. So again, this is just an artist reenactment, but it's artist rendering is the expression. Anyway, so this is artist rendering of what I was imagining. Like, what if I just had a text box where I could write some code? So I started playing around and seeing how close I could get to that. Now, the first thing I did is I started being introduced to some of the experts, Edward, Justin Norris, Dan Stevens, in this case, just names you guys might know. I heard about this kind of almost mythical feature called Munctions. I don't know if anybody on this call, especially the people newer to Marketo, has even heard of the idea of Munctions. But supposedly, and Dan said he had them in his instance at the time, this 2016 or something, there used to be something that actually was a lot like, was sort of like this one, or somewhere between this slide and this slide, existed in Marketo. And one thing that's amazing about Marketo is, unlike any other platform I've ever worked with, there are things that used to work that don't work anymore. And I suppose that that's reasonable in the evolutionary path of certain SaaS apps takes that path. And frankly, I have my own SaaS apps where I've sort of done that and turned off features because they were abused or not completely understood. So I get it, but Marketo really sort of stands out for me as a big name SaaS app where stuff, at least mythically, used to work and used to exist. So this is an example. There used to be something called Munctions, where you could pull a function in, and I guess it was something like Excel-style formulas or some variation of SQL-style formulas where you could put it right in a field. My assumption is Marketo's support team didn't feel like, responding to somebody else's, full database mess up, or just, individual questions, not so much the danger of it, but just the flexibility of introducing sort of a script step, right, will always naturally lead to an unlimited number of support calls. That's why Marketo support doesn't like answering tickets about velocity, for the same reason. You've got, if you work out the permutations, right? It's like you could billions of things, or an unlimited number of things you could do. So of course support has to place a ceiling on it, and usually the idea is that's your code. Don't call us. So that's, I think, what happened with Munctions. And so they never went beyond beta. I don't know how many enterprises ever really had them, but so there was like this tantalizing idea that someone certainly wanted this, but not enough people knew how to handle it or express it. Velocity tokens, as I mentioned, that was my first thought, was like, how about if I use velocity? Nah, it's not going to work. Doesn't change anything permanently. So then there was the day, whatever it was, in 2015 or something. I was like, well, you know, JavaScript is getting leaner and leaner. There are more and more ways to invoke it in these really small, what are called like containerized, or I don't know if any of these expressions are totally clear to the bulk of you, but very small, lean units of very fast execution. So unlike, say, a situation where you'd have to spin up a whole environment in which to execute those. I think someone chatted something about functions. I'm not sure, but could be. So I started realizing, you know, JavaScript is really ubiquitous. People are learning it. I'm not saying, by the way, that you can go from, you know, 0 to 100 in JavaScript overnight, but certainly more people in the world are going from, you know, 0 to 10 and going from, you know, newbie to beginner, newbie to intermediate very quickly. It's easy to learn. It's so many places out there that have working examples, code, totally supported. Also, the JavaScript working group, which is ECMAScript, the ECMA group in Europe, actually, they're always, I mean, in Europe is a weird way of putting it, but is technically headquartered in Europe. But new functions are being added to the core of JavaScript all the time, so you can evolve along with JavaScript. So I just thought that would be kind of a cool language. If I'm going to write it in something, it might as well be that. And the key really is the third bullet here, which is Marketo already kind of speaks JS because it knows how to encode my tokens and lead tokens in a way that JS can read them. Anyway, you'll see what I mean in a second. So that's kind of how I got here. I accomplished, you know, through some twists and turns, what I had been going for, the equivalent of a flow step that can run any function that's supported by JavaScript, any function in a flow step. Now, takes two parts. One, setting up a FlowBoost webhook in the webhook section in the admin UI and typing the code directly in the webhook editor. You can see here the payload template. It says capped is changed from lead, is a variable called capped, is set to last name to uppercase. So it's just about, it's 98% of what I was going for in one of those earlier slides. I was like fantasizing about putting it right in the flow step. I'm within the Marketo UI. There is no external app to ever log into. There's no place else that you ever need to maintain your code. There's no need to you know, separately execute or version anything. You can use the Marketo webhook UI, and everything stays within the Marketo interface, Marketo ecosystem visually. And so then once you've defined those functions, whatever they are, and again, just to flip back here, I could go in and edit this to whatever I want. This is just my free-form code, and I, as the Marketo admin, because I have access to this area, I can edit anything I want. And then anybody else in the Marketo instance can execute it from a flow. Here, I'm calling the webhook called FlowBoost capitalized last name, which is the same one you just saw a second ago. And then just another example, one of many that we'll see live in a moment, is a much more extensive one. I'm using a separate CSV hosted in Design Studio to correct known common typos in domains. So there's a full, that's not even the full range, but that's a good example if I can go from something that's, you know, string manipulation or, you know, numeric addition of scores, search and replace and so on, things that I think are actually awesome and perhaps the most common use overall for FlowBoost, but then you can get even greater than that and start like reading files, searching for patterns and replacing them with other patterns using this external file. And all of that stuff, again, is defined in the Marketo admin section. So here's my sort of sketch of the process. First, I tried to do like a sketch version of the Marketo logo there. I don't know if it worked for step one, but in step one, you just type your code right into the Marketo admin UI in the webhook section, whenever you want. You can, of course, test it wherever you want, test it separately if you'd like, but you can write it right in there. You set field mappings. If you want to write the results back to a Marketo field, typically something like capitalizing the last name, you want to write back the capitalized last name to the last name field, right? Sort of straightforward. In certain cases, you may just want to check like a value is true or false, and there's ways to do that without writing back to a field. But usually you do want to set up, you say like, I'm going to write some code and I'm going to pass back some values and write them back to values in Marketo. That's what we really mean by data management usually, right? So you write it back either to the same field or to another field. So that's all set up in step 1. And then step 2, you set up a smart campaign to run that hook in response to anything you want. So that could be a filled out form trigger when someone is, added to the system or merged into the system, a new person. And, in my demos, I'll use request campaign because it's easiest to just say request a campaign in the context of this existing lead. But, of course, in your real life experience, you'll probably end up triggering on the more common occurrences, if someone has just been added to a program or some form of intake or some event that has happened to them, and then you want to say, okay, let's fix up their last name, let's check their score, let's recompute their score every night, let's check to see. All the other data management things are usually done like on an event-based level. You know how number 3 works because you're a Marketo person. And then the new values are written back. Or as I said, in theory, you could have FlowBoost code that just passes back a true or false, and you can actually check that. I don't know if we'll get to showing you that example today, but certainly on November 10th I can. It's possible to just hand back a true-false result, or even a numeric result, it's up to you, and not write it back to a field. And that when you're like doing a lot of this stuff, you might sometimes want to do that. Like, why should I spend a Boolean field doing true or false for like whether someone is on a suppression list? I can just check if they're on the suppression list, it's true or false. So that's the process. Going over, this is sort of back to marketing speak to a degree. Not really a marketer, but to say this. So just to be very clear before we look right in the instance, FlowBoost isn't a set of macros. It's not a defined set of like a limited set of things you can do. No, it's the entire JavaScript language. It doesn't use the Marketo API. In the FlowBoost Pro edition, you could opt to use the Marketo REST API for certain super awesome stuff. Or standard can do it too. But the Community edition is not meant to be used with any like external service or anything like that. So and Marketo's cool. It doesn't meter your webhook responses in the way that it does REST API calls. So you could have 100,000 REST API calls, and a lot of them can be used up. The webhooks don't have anything to do with that at all. They don't compete with that. The limitations on webhooks are only the speed of light, if you will. We can talk about that maybe in the Q&A. So rather than being this like tiny set of limited functions where I'd have to sort of guess what you want, it lets you do anything you want, and all within the Marketo UI. I look at FlowBoost as primarily replacing, in addition to doing things you just simply can't do any other way, it replaces fundamentally the idea of exporting sometimes your entire DB or like major sections of your DB to Excel and running Excel macros on them and re-importing. So those processes just really frighten me. They're fragile, and as I mentioned, the little asterisk here, they sometimes are impossible. If you have duplicate email addresses in your database and you export to Excel and you want to change each of those, the values for each of those people differently, you can't do that. Marketo will not, when it remerges on email address, it's going to break all of that. You could use, sidebar, you can use an API-based import that dedupes on lead ID, but whoa, that's a totally different world, right? And do you really need to do that if all you're trying to do is like, capitalize or like do a search and replace in a string? It's kind of, I mean, it's cool if you have a developer who can do that. But anyway, so I look at it as replacing those Excel processes, and sometimes those Excel processes, you may not have thought about it, don't even work. And then the other thing that it replaces is like these kind of hack together attempts, and I'd love to push the platform itself to its fullest. But these ideas of like, I set a temp field to another value, and then I set that same temp field to this value, and then if there's a data value change, if this data value changes trigger, that tells me that the two values were originally different or not when you're comparing like the equality of two values, which like even that, Rusty hadn't mentioned that at the very beginning. You're going to talk about a thing that you would think Marketo can do, right? Marketo can't do that out of the box. You can't say, just for want of a better expression, does the first name equal the last name? You can't do that. I mean, that's, again, not throwing the solid platform decisions under the bus, but that kind of blew my mind at the very beginning. But so there are sometimes ways of sort of simulating in like a tactical, all hands, we messed up our data situation. You can do what I'm describing there in the second bullet, like change that. But that's not stuff that you want to have as part of your general workflow. FlowBoost is supposed to be part of your life all the time, and of course can do things that you could never simulate in this way. But I'm saying the sort of pseudo hacks you can sometimes do in a smart list with certain certain logic, that's done. And exporting and re-importing, I'd also like to say that's done if you're using FlowBoost. That's my goal at least. And similarly, FlowBoost complements, but does not completely replace things like a separate worksheet of, let's say, as I was noting, an account manager mapping from like domains to account managers, or the suppression list idea, or domain fix-up, or any kind of lookup tables. Those are meant to be, or FlowBoost is meant to work with those. So saving them as CSVs, putting them in Design Studio enables you to have, again, within the Marketo ecosystem, the equivalent of a lookup table. And also, it doesn't necessarily aim to replace certain, specialized data enrichment tools, your Discover or whatever, but can help you not call those tools unnecessarily. Things like other kinds of validations and verifications that also do things like just on the string fix up. You could do that in FlowBoost alone, and then like only farm out certain things to those other vendors. But it's certainly meant to work with those databases. Sometimes actually a cool thing you could do, to get too off topic, but I knew that I would, is you can use FlowBoost Pro Edition at least. No, I keep saying that, Standard Edition. FlowBoost Standard Edition, you could use to call multiple external webhooks. Let's say you had multiple enrichment vendors and you wanted to get all the values back and then pre-process them before deciding which one to return to Marketo. You can do that, and actually it's faster and more efficient than calling each of those. Assuming those enrichment tools are also called as a webhook, whether they be, I don't know, Clearbit, Discover, all manner of those competitors. Rather than call a separate webhook for all of those, you can call FlowBoost, have FlowBoost issue all those calls in parallel, which is more efficient. I have a blog post about this, more efficient. Wait for all the results to come back, and then you can use your own logic to determine which one should win out, or whether the value should come back and be rewritten. That's another thing. So pre-processing, instead of just saying your data enrichment tool gets to overwrite your current data regardless of what the enrichment tool returns, you can pass it through that FlowBoost layer and go, I don't know, that doesn't look right for whatever reason, and so I'm going to leave the existing value in Marketo alone. And so in that sense, FlowBoost is acting as a reverse, working as an inhibitor rather than writing back to fields. It's sort of helping you not accidentally overwrite fields if you don't want to. And again, just removing the stuff we don't like. And we're going to get back to FB counter in a moment. So now here's the moment where I'm going to switch over to my Marketo test instance. This is the moment in the old days, pre-pandemic, real life, where I'd be like, any questions, but I can't do that. But I hope everyone's okay. Let me just check to see if there are any chat questions that came in that are relevant to right now. Okay, those would be questions that we'll work on later. All right, so here we have a test instance, which I hope everyone can see. I had to set up a little bitty program here, and the reason that I set up this program is I want to be able to use my tokens when I call FlowBoost. You can call FlowBoost just on lead tokens. That means you can call it from anywhere in the marketing activities tree, but as all experienced practitioners in Marketo know, the ability to have program level my tokens and take advantage of inheritance and all the other kind of maintainability things is cool too. So when you're calling FlowBoost code, you can include my tokens in the code, which means that wherever you're calling it from in the MA tree, right, that's going to change what is passed and what the code does. So that's why I created a program here instead of just like a straight up smart campaign. And I have a set of easy to difficult, they're in alphabetical order, of course, but sort of simple to semi-advanced functions we're going to call in a second. And have a test form because we're going to look at, and that's kind of maybe the crowning part of the live demo. We're going to look at capping event registrants using FB counter. I hope we get there. I realize this should be 5 minutes ago. Oh well. And I have a list of FlowBoost demo leads. I did kind of forget to re-import them yesterday with their fresh values, so we'll just work with what we've got. But these are my 7 test leads. So just looking at the campaigns, take a quick look. I hope that it was already clear from the earlier points, but let's take, I think the simplest one of all these is this last name to uppercase. So it's a very simple and familiar process, unless you're less familiar with campaign as requested, but that's a basic trigger in any Marketo Smart Campaign. And then the flow is simply calling my capitalized last name function. We'll look at that in a sec. The schedule, when you're running something like a last name to uppercase, you probably do want to make sure that everyone can run through the flow every time. There's no reason to assume that, over the lifetime of the lead, they wouldn't need to run through this more than once. So generally you do that with a FlowBoost webhook, but there may be certain cases where you want to use it in conjunction with that, the really cool like scheduling, requalification rules once a week, once every 30 days, and so on, depending on what you want to do. And so working, again, that's the way that FlowBoost meshes with and complements, maybe I should have that on another bullet point, complements Marketo's scheduling and qualification rules. Once you get into the flow, you can do whatever you want. And it's the same pattern, by the way, with any of these other ones. Here's another one, search and replace in the lead field. Again, this is assuming, and we'll look at what it's searching and replacing in a sec. This is assuming you're going to run this an unlimited number of times over the lead's lifetime. This is reporting some chaff in the department field, and we'll see how that works in a sec. But let's check out last name to uppercase, and let's run that against one of our demo leads. Close these down because they've probably expired. So we're going to look at Old Dirty Boosted here. Old Dirty Boosted has a last name. Simple, first, last. Now I'm just going to use this. You'll find yourself as you work on, you probably already do this when you're working on campaigns like this. Using request campaign is great because you don't have to like fill out a form. And one thing I definitely did not want to do live during this demo is wait for a form fill to be processed, because we know that that can have, occasional latency, and, tapping my fingers for 60 seconds wasn't something I was interested in. All right, so we're running that. As we know, Marketo also does, schedules these things in the background. Still waiting. Oh, I'm getting impatient. Is this going to be the thing where that people are saying on Slack where? Oh, okay, good. Do not want my app SJ01 to go down during this, right? But it is, people have said that Smart Campaign execution is slow on SJ. I don't know if that applies here today, but let's take a look. All right, great. Now we see that I requested the campaign, last name to uppercase. The last name was changed from Boosted to Boosted, all caps, and then we get a log of the called webhook. If you looked at the called webhook, not that you need this kind of debugging, we know the last name changed as we wanted, so we know it's working. But you can look, you can actually see everything that Marketo sent to FlowBoost exactly. You see that it sent this payload, which is sending the last name, instead of just the lead.last name token, it shows you what the actual value is during the execution, which is cool for debugging. So it sent, Boosted to uppercase, and then it got back the response Boosted, and because we already had set up that webhook to do that capitalization, that worked just fine. Now let's look at another example. I think this one's kind of cool. Now this is a simple search and replace in the lead field. We'll look at the code for it in a moment. I wanted to jump in and show you how these things kind of work in real life before looking at what the code is doing in the webhook section. But this one is doing a search and replace on, if memory serves, extra stuff in the department field. So the department field will be over here, right? So the idea is sometimes it's just kind of playing around with the idea of what kind of thing you might want to do in real life. Let's say somebody had the accounting department as their name of the department. You want to shorten that to just accounting. So the idea is you want to go through everybody who might have accidentally, you know, maybe it's because of some weird entry point from some other system, or just the salesperson might have mistyped it, or you know, been too lengthy in it. We want to take out the and the department, and we just want to set that department back to accounting. So there's a prefab hook waiting to run to do that. Let's watch it happen. I feel like internally there's a timer of when do I say something is going to work, and then just because of the law of demos, I've accidentally typed the wrong thing or something. Yeah, so this is the search and replace. Again, I'm requesting the campaign, so it calls the hook and does the work. If you were going to do like a giant batch, you would do the same thing. You'd set up a batch, you know, 20,000 people, set them to request a campaign, and then it would call the webhook. In Marketo, a hook can only be called from a trigger campaign. But that trigger can, as we're seeing right here, be request campaign. So just saying that something needs to be triggered is not prohibitive. It just means there's actually a brand new function called execute campaign that's coming out that should actually be even better for this, but I'm waiting for that. I guess it's in beta. But yeah, so the key is that you do have to have some kind of trigger, filled out form, new person, or just request campaign where you change it from a batch or whatever you want to do. So let's hope I got this one. All right, here we go. Here's our example number 2. First, this is my manual change because you saw me type it and change it to the accounting department. Then I ran this FlowBoost hook via the campaign. It changed the data value from the accounting department to just accounting. I was trying to chop off the V in the department. It would do that regardless of what's in the middle. As you know, with the infinite number of possible values in that field, you can't just have, it's impractical, I would even say impossible, to have all the possible values that would be in that middle word or middle words. You're just trying to trim out the and department when they are at the beginning and end. That's one single tiny line of simple JavaScript that's over in the webhooks area. And of course, log the hook, showing the code that was run. This was the lead token, the apartment, and we just, the accounting department. That was weird, skipped the word. And we replaced the at the beginning and or department at the end with an empty string. That's how it works. That's that single line of, you know, ubiquitous, you know, very common Java string replace. It's an infinitely flexible thing. So here I just put the at the beginning and department at the end and replace it. And now, of course, we got back the new response, new department, accounting, bang, this person is fixed up. You could run that across anybody who, you know, let's say if you were only interested in those that already had the at the beginning, you could do your batch to reduce, you know, the number of invocations. In Community Edition, by the way, you have 100,000 invocations of 100,000 calls per month. So, so far today, you know, we've used 2. But if you wanted to, if there are situations where you can reduce it by pre-filtering, by all means you should do so. Like if you only cared about if they had the at the beginning, then set up your smart list to qualify people whose department value starts with THE, and then run them through the hook to do the actual change. So that's a way of filtering things down and you know, decreasing the resources used and letting you also use your community API key to the fullest, because we do want you to be able to I don't want people to have to do something where the moment they need to do it in reality, they need to have like the standard edition. Community is used by, well, there are about 500 keys in the world. I think that they're probably used by, I don't know, 60 or 70 Marketo users right now. And when you come up with, I wanted to say this before, I think most organizations that use FlowBoost will end up with a few critical hooks that are running all the time, maybe some ad hoc hooks for, you know, emergency fix-up like we might be doing here, or, you know, specific projects for fix-up. unlike, as you'll see in a moment when I look in the webhook section, this test instance here, which is one of my client's instances, in fact, where I built out a lot of these sort of proofs of concept many years ago, has like 30 different FlowBoost webhooks defined, and they use it so extensively. But you know, in reality, you probably, especially as a new user, don't want to be like, okay, I need to have 30 different things I do with FlowBoost. Start with a few core things. And again, that's why I think the community edition should be something that, with your core functions, you can really get started. And it's not going to be like, oops, you ran out of API calls, because 100,000 a month, you can really get things going. All right, so those were two of our cool examples. I'd like to think they're cool. Now here's another one. Here's something that you might not have really thought about. If you have a multi-valued field in Marketo, one that's backed by, oh geez, because we start, how much time will I have? Well, I'll finish this, but I won't run it. I'll finish describing it, but I won't run it. If you have a multi-valued field, one that's backed by a multi-select or multiple checkboxes where multiple ones can be checked at the same time on a Marketo form, or anything that's a SFTC pick list that gets synced over, you know that gets synced over as a semicolon delimited list. There's no way in Marketo to say if somebody is interested or begins to have like product interest, apples, oranges, and pears, and you want to remove oranges from everyone who had oranges, maybe there was a mistake on a form or just general data cleanliness, you've changed the name, for example, of that product interest, and you want to change the name everywhere. There's no way in Marketo to do that. To Marketo, on the back end, frustratingly, on the back end, it's just a semicolon delimited string. Even if on the front end, it makes it seem like it's different fields you can check off, or in a multi-select different options that you can control click and select. On the back end, it just gets wrapped up into a string. So the one I'm not going to run is showing you how you could pluck out and or replace one part of a multi-valued string that comes from a pick list, which is very cool. The one I want to jump into, and I realize, let me just see if any of those chats are coming from the people. I will explain that later. Okay, those are some good Q&As coming in. Sorry, I get easily distracted by that because I don't know if it's like Rusty saying, dude, you have 1 minute, literally.
Take your time. Take your time.
Okay, no, I mean, I mean, we started 10 minutes late, right? No,
yeah.
Not 10 minutes late, but yeah, my timing is okay. But I'm not sure. But I hope I have all the time in the world. I hope that some people can go a few minutes over. Well, I don't want to go more than like 10 minutes over, and then we can skip to November 10th. But I'm not cutting people off directly at S3 for sure. But so I wanted to. That's the idea of the multi-valued. But I want to show you something I think that takes it up a notch in terms of the coolness, what you can do. This FlowBoost webhook, again, defined in the webhooks UI, uses a CSV. The CSV is hosted in Design Studio. And here it is. It's a CSV of domain typos. Now, you can use this same concept in, again, an infinite number of ways. That's why, as I say, FlowBoost isn't just like a canned little set of tiny things you can do. Let's look at so this is the original Excel file, of course, abbreviated. There would be, I presume, a lot more in here, and you could do pattern replacement, whatever. But this is a gentle intro to how cool it is that you can use a CSV as a lookup table. So I've just created a very simple Excel spreadsheet here. It's got the typo domain and its corrected domain. So gmail.cm is going to be corrected to email.com, and email.test is going to be corrected to example.test. I save that as a CSV, and I uploaded it into Design Studio. Then I wrote a FlowBoost webhook in the admin section that can call that. So let's check that out. Now, in this case, I have the corrected email address writing back to a secondary, not the main email address field. I'm sending the email address field to the checker, but the response, the corrected email address, is being written back to a special field called corrected email address. That's just a little sanity check where you can do that and then run a separate batch if you want to, or not if you want, but when you decide to, set a separate batch to set everybody's email address, system email address field to their corrected email address field. I just like to kind of, something this sensitive, I think you guys can imagine from things in the past, you may not want to write it directly back to the email address, but kind of offload it to a secondary field, especially if you're doing this like full DB fix-up or whatever, and then look at those and be like, okay, that looks cool, and then run a batch to set the corrected address back to the, to overwrite the main email address at the corrected email address. But that's what this one does. Let me see if I can use another one of these people to test on. I'm going to go over here. By the way, I wish I could see your faces to see, as I said when we were rehearsing with Rusty the other day, to see how many of you have any idea what these stupid puns are all about and how many of you are too young or too non-hip-hop to know what my stupid pun names are. All right, so now I've changed, I actually changed it to the wrong address, I think. I think it's actually, the one that's supposed to be corrected is test. There we go. So it's got to be one that's eligible to be corrected, right? Okay. That looks right. I think that's it. Let me just, I just want to double check. This is as good a reason as any to double check. I'm going to check that CSV one more time. And again, the CSV could be just a list of all the email addresses you can't send to. I think using FlowBoost as a way of loading suppression lists from third-party vendors is really cool. You could have, it's easy to say, oh, you just put somebody in one main list in Marketo, but that means those people all need to be in your DB. I've worked with clients who have multiple people they're doing concierge services type for within the same shared instance. So each one might have lists of 10,000, 100,000 people who have unsubscribed. You can't just put those people in your database in order to, you can try to use durable unsubscribe, but that won't work if they're not actually unsubscribed for each sub-client, right? You need a separate list. So your only choice would be to put them in Marketo and leave them in Marketo, thus racking up your Marketo costs as a result. So using an external CSV, using external CSV as a suppression list is really, it absolutely needs to say pays for itself, especially if it's going to be multiple lists with hundreds of thousands of people each. All that is money that you save. I just want to take a look at this, make sure I remember what's in it. Yeah, example dot. Yeah. Sorry, guys. I changed that CSV at the last minute, so I want to make sure that I'm correcting something correctable. Example.tesdt. All right, now, can I boost? Yes, you can. I'm going to run the typo corrector. And the typo corrector is going to grab that CSV, scan for the person, scan to see if the person's left-hand side, let's say the typo domain exists, and then if it is, it replaces it with the corrected domain. FlowBoost has an admittedly undocumented caching ability. I say undocumented, it doesn't kick in unless you want it to. And if we talk next time, I can show you how to do something like that on the 10th. If you don't cache, then it's going to grab that CSV and scan it each time, which depending on the size of the CSV would either be completely harmless or like kind of wasteful if the CSV isn't changing that much. So you can set it so that it won't check for a new CSV, like except after 5 minutes, or cache it for a day or something like that, and that's faster. But right now it's going to live reload the CSV, which actually means that if I had gone in to here and done like a replace image or file, it would immediately take effect. Let's take a look. Oh, wrong person, right? Let's take a look. All right, perfect. So these were my manual changes. And then we see that requested my corrector campaign, and then it set the email address corrected field. I mentioned I'd offloaded this to a secondary field just in case you wanted to do a spot check. And it sets that corrected field to The same left-hand side, the mailbox side is of course the same, and the right-hand side gets corrected to example.test from example.test, and you could run anything, any logic that kind of leverages the same idea can be done with FlowBoost. A CSV with a bunch of columns you want to compare to see if someone, again, I mentioned this a moment ago, I think account managers, for example, you could have a domain, you could account managers by domain, by region, and by preferred language, let's say, and have those each be columns in an Excel spreadsheet. Save it as a CSV, use FlowBoost to decipher what the person's assigned account manager should be, or other sort of multivariate lead value assignments. Obviously something that I say obviously, I would shudder and probably refuse to try to build that in a Marketo flow if it even could be done at all because of the number of permutations, but just putting it in a sheet and looking up in the sheet is child's play, right? So, you know, it's too bad. I think the time today, I want to get to a few minutes of Q&A, so I'm going to stop before showing you the webinar registrant counter thing. I just have to. I apologize, but I'm going to stop and we'll take some Q&A, and if anyone wants to say maybe later than that, if specifically I can do the registrant counter examples after, you know, the 10 minutes of Q&A. But let's so let's pause, and Rusty, I don't know if you want to take this to a specific Q&A level, or should I just go over all the things, the open questions?
I'm happy to jump in for the Q&A and kind of go through some of these. You know, I think as a long-term practitioner, this stuff is so fascinating. It's all those things that you get asked to do, and you're limited by you know, Marketo's ability to do that. So this really just opens up a ton of stuff. The couple of questions here, one that I wanted to specifically address on the, you know, you're correcting an email domain per se. And one of the questions was, is there a potential for creating a duplicate because you were putting a new email address back in? It's my assumption that you're addressing that record specifically. So it's not a risk of a duplicate. It's a manipulation of that field that's currently in there. It's not like a new record creation. Is that fair to say, Sanford?
Yes, it doesn't. It does not create a new duplicate. Should there already be a duplicate, though, like let's say there's someone who's already in there with the correctly spelled name, this is not going to do a merge automatically based on that, because it's not checking the rest of the DB. It's just looking, you know, it's insulated and looking at that particular lead. So right. It's just, but yeah, I mean, in theory, if the person already existed with their correctly spelled address. That's this typo domain thing. To be very clear, there are a lot of things, and I say this about a lot of things people do with FlowBoost. I actually have to admit this. Like, I don't know if I would do that, but I know people do. I know that that's a real life example from an educational institution, that somebody has a typo domain, corrected domain thing. Another example would be when people try to, quote, fix up the case of somebody's name. That's why I specifically changed the last name to uppercase in my example, because that's safe. You've probably seen me say on the community or something, if someone is like, I want to fix someone's case so it's correct, and I kind of grind my teeth because you can't know how to correctly capitalize somebody's name. It will inevitably mess up and possibly offend certain people. That's why I kind of shy away from it. But that being said, I know people do it, and I know that FlowBoost can do it. So there's a kind of balance there, but that would be, you know, typo domain. Sorry, long answer to the typo domain question.
No, that's great. And kind of rolls into our next question here too. On the CSV, you know, we looked at kind of limited examples, but is there a limit or a time delay or a time lag that you should be cognizant of if you've got, like, you know, multiple rows in a CSV and you're calling up to do a lookup? How is that processing?
Well, it's really a question of the overall size. Even a CSV is a very small text file. And gets compressed with gzip, but that's a whole other question. So like 1,000 rows is not a thing. 10,000 rows is not a thing. 100,000 rows might be a thing, but not because of the amount of time it takes to scan 100,000 rows in memory, which is less than a millisecond. You would never notice that, but because of the size of transferring the file each time in order to read it. So if that's why I mentioned, if you can set it to cache so it only reads the file once per day. And then searching that list, even searching a list of 1 million people is nothing. It's really just the resulting size of the text file and how long, you know, how big it is can sometimes make a difference as far as getting it. Because what FlowBoost is doing is it's going to Design Studio and taking the CSV and then scanning it. So the bigger it is, you know, there is definitely a chance that instead of taking, you know, 1 second, 2 seconds to grab it, you know, if it takes 10 seconds to download it, that's 10 seconds. That's a long time even. It wouldn't even be that much. But, you know, that's what you're padding out. That's what you want to avoid if you have a super, super big one. But again, 1,000 names, 10,000 names, that's not even big enough to matter.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Great. So here's a question for just kind of my own edification as well. You mentioned earlier that, you know, there's a lot of noobs going into JavaScripting and trying to get up to a basic level. Are there places where you can find kind of pre-built JavaScript, you know, processes that, you know, you can kind of start to look at? I know we looked at some basic examples, but do you have recommendations on kind of where to start once I have my community edition, where I can go to?
Well, I think this kind of goes to the question of having a goal. One of the hardest things to do learning any platform or any language or maybe anything in life in general is if you don't have a project, somebody depending on you or you depending on yourself to deliver something to your boss that's cool or whatever, you don't really know where to start. So I would say you have to have a business need for something, and then that propels you into learning how to build it. The MDN, that's the Mozilla Developer Network, JavaScript docs are considered the gold standard. There's also JavaScript.info is written by one of the JavaScript original, the members of the ECMAScript committee, I believe. JavaScript.info is great. Those are totally reliable. Don't use like W3 schools because it sucks. But like if you use MDN, every example on MDN of how to use every function in JavaScript is accurate and great place to learn. There are physical books you can still use. You could take, I mean, that's the thing is it's so ubiquitous that there are an infinite number of generally accurate ways to learn it and to start from the scratch of like numbers and string manipulation, like using string replace, right? That's one of the most basic functions in JavaScript. You could just use, you can just Google JS string replace. It'll take you to the MDN page and explain all the options of how to use string replace. So the way I've always looked at FlowBoost is MDN, Mozilla Developer Network, is like the FlowBoost manual, because there are some exceptions of some extra cool stuff that FlowBoost does, but for the most part, there's no way to articulate as like a subset, if that answers the question. But you have to know what you're trying to do. So look at your last goal that you couldn't accomplish. The last thing, to some degree, the last thing that like your boss asked you if you could do in Marketo, this is one of my sort of like taglines sometimes, and you said no, reconsider that. Think about it. Wait, could I do it with FlowBoost? You know, and I mean this in like a very earnest way. I have stopped saying no because I know that I have FlowBoost at my disposal, and I know I need to evaluate in my head what could I do this with, you know, with FlowBoost in my ecosystem. So sometimes like a client will ask me something like scoring algorithm thing, like, and they'll say, can Marketo do it? And you know, without skipping a beat, I'll be like, sure. But in my head, I'm like, well, yes, because FlowBoost can do it. And that's kind of key. You got to have those questions coming in. You got to have the needs, the requirements. Right. And then it's MDN. Yeah.
And I'm sure we'll include some information and resources on where you can kind of, you know, you mentioned the JavaScript.info. We can include that in follow-up emails and things like that. I know that we're just at time here, but I did want to kind of, you know, pose the question to, what is the difference between, like, we've got community, which I encourage everybody to go out and at least sign up for and try the community edition of FlowBoost. You know, you've seen some of the cool stuff you can do. What would be a reason to move up to standard? What would you know, be required to you know, process for standard?
Well, yeah, I mean, standard is 500,000 calls per month as opposed to 100,000, so that can be the reason to cross the threshold. The other thing is that standard can connect to other external services. There was a moment that I mentioned the advantages of using FlowBoost to combine the output of multiple enrichment services. Those would be remote services, so standard would be necessary to call those remote services. Community can talk to files that are hosted on Design Studio, like we saw today. That's all community feasible. But it has to be reading a file that's in Marketo itself. Standard would also be necessary if you wanted to use like the Marketo REST API, a whole other ball of wax, and something that you probably want to be more experienced developer before you do that, but you need standard to do that because without standard, you can't open a connection to the Marketo REST API, or again, so it's like considered the external service connections is a standard thing. But reading files from Marketo Design Studio and all the other cool stuff that we did today is a community thing.
Excellent, awesome. And I do want to mention, because I know we're at time here, but we can stay over for sure.
Yeah, there are some people I did. Yeah, I wanted to answer. Can I answer these people's live questions?
Yeah, just want to, for those that do need to jump, we are going to be back on November 10th doing a webinar. We'll have even more in-depth discussion on what's possible and some of those things. So if you do need to jump, feel free to. You find us back on November 10th. We'll send that out in the post-event email. So watch for that. But for those who want to hang around, myself included, and see some more cool stuff on FlowBoost, you're welcome to stay on.
Yeah. So I was going to go with, I'll just answer a few in order. I'll keep everyone's name anonymous, but somebody asks, looking at the activity log for last name to uppercase, can I explain why the order is 1, request campaign, 2, change data value, 3, call webhook? That's because, and the question there is about here, that the call webhook is 3rd in line if you say that this is in reverse descending time order. Marketo logs a call webhook when all of the processes that the webhook has done are complete. So I guess it's kind of it's not really an evasive answer. It's more like because that's the way it is. That's the way that Marketo chooses to log it, is that the webhook is considered done after the change data value has been written. That's why. So that's absolutely expected, that the change data value appears first, and then the call webhook is considered to have happened after that. The question about the duplicates in the email address, yes, potentially. User F asks, can I expand on examples of the integrate with anything you want feature? I think that what I'm driving at there is what I just mentioned about the standard edition abilities to connect to any external services, combine their results, process them, crunch them, and then return them to Marketo. Those services can be, for example, services that aren't normally webhook compatible. That's a really cool thing you can do with FlowBoost's help. For example, so not to belabor this point, but I have a whole blog post about it, but like the idea of a webhook is it's stateless, meaning you just send the data, it's one request, and you get a response back. And then you don't have to get a pre-auth like identity key or anything else like that in a webhook. The problem is a lot of very cool REST APIs exist out there that they don't break that contract, but they don't conform to that contract. Because they require that you go to the identity endpoint, get an access token, and then maybe refresh that access token and so on. All those extra steps, which seem simple if you're building like a client app on your workstation, are not things that work with webhooks. But with FlowBoost, they can, because the connection to FlowBoost is a single request response, right? But within the FlowBoost code, you can get the access token and then do the secondary call, then maybe do the tertiary call, like maybe you're doing a thing where you have to look up like an ID and then dereference whatever, an email address and look up again. So these multi-step processes that might be necessary in like a sophisticated REST API can be made webhook compatible by encapsulating them in a FlowBoost call. So that would be an example of integrate with anything you want, I would say. User G asks about the email performance of the corrected emails. You got me. User F asks about the lookup example. It sounds like a good workaround for the Marketo limitation of no more than 20 smart lists in a flow. Yeah, I would agree with that. Certainly concentrating on one single, that's a kind of, again, it's almost like what I said a moment ago about the combining of the sort of multiplexing of multiple calls into one FlowBoost call. FlowBoost can grab the CSV contents, scan them, parse them, do pattern matching, and figure out the row that matches, and then hand back a single result to Marketo. And Marketo just counts it as a flow step. There's no nested smart list or any other kind of janky limitations in Marketo. The only restriction on webhooks, by the way, is that they have to finish in under 30 seconds. And let me tell you, if you're getting even close to 30 seconds, you're probably doing something wrong. So, you expect these to finish in, under, between 1 and 5 seconds. So, But yeah, I would agree there are restrictions on nested smart lists and the processing that Marketo is willing to do within its own infrastructure that you can offload to. Ultimately, FlowBoost is providing you with an extension of Marketo's infrastructure. So that's the cool thing. User asks about the webhook call, the CSV. I will type that if anyone stays on the call, sure, or click over that. Many other ideas. Can I write to the CSV saved in Design Studio? Asks user K. Not with Community, because Community is designed it just allows you to read from Design Studio files, which by the way don't have to be CSVs, JSON files or anything you want, if you want to go crazy. But no, you can't write. But Standard Edition you could, because you could use the Marketo REST Asset API. You could update the CSV if you wanted to do that. I would venture that, while I would certainly invite you to do it, that may not be as common. I would say it's more common with something like this, that it would be like a file that's uploaded, that's either in like Google Sheets or Smartsheet or Excel, and then you save it and upload it in Design Studio and replace it in Design Studio. But if you wanted to update it from FlowBoost, you could. You need standard for that. And okay, so those pretty much are the questions. So let me just quickly jump over, because two people asked the same question, and I really wanted to get to more of this today. You can tell that I could stay on forever. But I wanted to not go too fast also and like skip over stuff. So that's kind of it's a balancing act, I've done demos where I've gone so fast I had no idea what I was doing. So that's so just actually this is cool, and I really I hope that a few people are still on. I haven't done a count.
Yeah, we still have a good crowd.
Oh, great, awesome. Yeah. Okay, great. So maybe for these 20-odd people, it's great, so they can still see this next step. In the webhooks area here, you see, and you're familiar with the idea of having like a clonable program template. I have the same idea here with a FlowBoost clonable template. It's just a basic setup, and I can clone that to create each of my additional my FlowBoost hooks, and the payload template is just your code here. So take a look at these. I want to go through the ones that I did from sort of the simplest to the more complex. Here's the capitalized last name one that we ran. You can see the code is typed right in here in the template in the webhook. The response attribute capped is mapped back to the Marketo field last name. Like I said, with something like capitalization, you probably want to overwrite directly. Here's our search replace, and again, very similar idea. It's just a one-liner in JavaScript to replace the at the beginning or department at the end, and then new department that's the response attribute, is mapped back to the main department field. We're overwriting directly. Here's one, just kind of want to go up a little bit here. Here's an example of adding scores. It's another thing that Marketo, you kind of would think, why can't it do this? You know that there are certain, just date math, you can do a little bit of date math, you can add like a score token to a score, but you can't do this in Marketo alone, which is another thing that kind of continually blows my mind, adding scores together. With FlowBoost, it's easy as pie. We're just adding up these three tokens together. We're defaulting them to 0, of course, but we're doing like lead score 1, lead score 2, and lead score 3. We're mapping those back to final score and then overwriting the lead score with those. So, and as you can imagine, while this is a very simple concept of just adding up some constituent scores, whether they be behavioral, demographic, firmographic, you could do anything in here. You can put a threshold. You could say, add up to X points from the demographic score, and then make sure that the max is, only 90, and then translate it to a letter grade even. I think I probably said something about that before, and have that all happen within this code right here. So there's no need for the mind-blowing, impossible to follow smart lists. Another advantage of using FlowBoost is that once you know how your code works and what it does, it's a lot easier to share it with other people. So like someone new could come on board, and they might not be expert in all the crazy stuff you did in your smart list to kind of maybe sort of, and by the way, I'm not even saying you could do what I just described, but like, let's say there are certain things that with hacks of chain smart campaigns and temporary fields or whatever, you might be able to do certain things. Even so, a new person added to your Marketo instance in your organization, especially a person new to the marketing automation world, would have no idea how it works. Great way to lose your job is to not know how a smart campaign works, right, when you get a new one. So on the other hand, this logic here and logic like it is all expressed in one place, not in different hacky places, and is, once you get the hang of it, really easy to comprehend. Now, right, and then there's one more was the removal from the multi-valued field. I just wanted to scale up. I know someone wants to see the domain typo lookup CSV, which I'm going to click on in 1 second, but I just want to scale up from there. This is a simple code that I use to remove a product from that list. Remember I said, like, if you liked, let's say you liked like TVs, refrigerators, and cell phones or whatever, and your company stopped making refrigerators, or you to switch refrigerators to freezers, or whatever the permutations were, and you wanted to replace it. This is the code to do that. We're just taking the product interest field, which is that semicolon delimited field that I'm mentioning. We split it on the semicolon. That's what you got to do to get the individual parts. We filter it to make sure that each, to check each part to see if it matches the one we want to get out of there. Remove it if it's not there, and join it back with a semicolon, and write the string field right back to Marketo. No other way to do that within the Marketo, Marketo flow at all. So a very cool and useful thing when you're using pick lists.
That one has some great application too. I don't know if there's any Dynamics users on the call, but if you're familiar with Dynamics, it writes, your pick lists are all GUID and comes over as an alphanumeric string. You could use this actually to standardize that data coming over from Dynamics. So that's a struggle that I had. I wish I'd had FlowBoost at the time.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And you could use a CSV with the mappings and read that in and map it. Right. Another thing you can do with this, just to dwell for one more sec, this kind of concept is, suppose you had a multi-valued field and you wanted to split it into different Boolean fields. Like you realized, I probably shouldn't have had a multi-valued field. I should have had different bools or different date times or whatever. You can use the same concept to do that. Split it and then write back each individual value to a Boolean field and map those back to your new Boolean fields. Something that, for otherwise, if you just you change the field management to Boolean, I mean, it's impossible. There's no other way to do it. You'd lose all the data and so on. So great way to rescue yourself there. Now, here is the entirety of that domain lookup CSV. It uses the fetch API, which is a standard JavaScript API. Well published and documented on MDN. It does use something a little bit, I don't want to say special, it's a little bit prefab. I mean, you could write all of this in pure JS, but I will acknowledge that just for convenience, there is a function called string parts from email that's built into FlowBoost that splits an email address into its mailbox part and its domain part. So it's very simple. As I said, you could write that in JS itself, but I kind of canned it. I canned that one inside the product just because, common marketing automation need, right? So that splits you into the two parts, mailbox and domain. We get the CSV file, parse it using a CSV auto parse, which is okay. That's also canned, but you could do it all in pure JS. Just to keep this as short as possible, you can just run it through the auto parser, and then that just turns each row into a JS object with a typo domain. The domain, every column in your CSV becomes a property of the JS object. So all I'm doing here is going get the CSV, parse it into rows, and then for each row, see if there's a row that has the typo domain equal to the domain part of the email address. It's kind of just expressing in code the same concept. Does the typo domain equal the email part's domain? And then, if we found it, we take the mailbox side, that's the left-hand side, right? I'm on my monitor's reversed, so anyway, left-hand side, the mailbox side, and then we append the corrected domain to it, and we put the @ sign in the middle. So mailbox plus @ sign plus the corrected domain, which is taken directly from the CSV. You remember that over here, right? The corrected domain, typo domain, corrected domain, left hand, right hand. And then we're done. Now this probably can't be any shorter than this. So there definitely, you can see the line from last name to uppercase using, you know, basic string stuff. Adding scores is just plus. That's numeric plus. That's, you know, that's easy enough. This is splitting and filtering, and then maybe, admittedly, the line gets a little bit more vertical for this stuff, just because there's no one-liner that can take care of this. But this is, as I mentioned, it's a standard fetch API, and that's that. But I didn't get to talk about, but we'll talk about on the 10th for sure. I really wish I got into it today, is the way of incrementing a webinar counter. Incrementing a webinar counter is actually incredibly simple. It is only a two-liner, setting up a counter name and then adding someone to the counter. And that was the really cool thing that I was going to show you, of how as you add people to a webinar, you're updating this counter, and then you can use that counter on a special form. And the form page, again, we didn't get to work on this. The form page decides whether the current registrant count is above or below your max. That max registrant count is set in a my token, which is cool. And yeah, that's what I was gonna show you. But darn, these things are not. So on November 10th, I can start exactly with here. But the cool thing about FB Counter, let me just finish this last thing, if anybody's still on. Cool thing about FB Counter, it counts things. That's it. It counts anything you want. And so we can count webinar attendees. We can count the number of times that you've seen a company name. You know, use it as an account counter within your database. Unique web visits by a lead to like a particular, you know, set of pages, as opposed to just counting web page views themselves, which, as you know, in Marketo, count, if you refresh the page, it counts the same page over and over again. So you can count anything, and that's the cool thing. So webinar attendees are very common, probably the most common and original goal of using FB Counter. The counter name is just some string you set up, and then it's shared by everyone. And the cool thing is that you can read the counts of an FB Counter, registrant counter, let's say, from a web page using your public key. And that's how that page that I was just on, whoops, not that one, but this one, that's how this LP works. It reads the registrant count and then determines whether the webinar is full or not. I'm so far over time that I'm just going to do this. I'm just going to do this anyway, but I'm going to set up the max registrants to 4. And reopen that. Whoop. And Marketo doesn't like to refresh immediately. Whoop. All right. Marketo caches that LP for a sec. Now you can see that I've set the max registrant counts to 4, so I get the ability to sign up for the upcoming webinar. Previously, when I had it set, I should have left that open in the other tab, with a registrant count of 2, I got instead that you are waitlisted message, and this is all based on just standard form. I'm really going too fast now. Standard form visibility rules is all it's using there, but it's based on the ability. The core here is the ability to read the registrant count because you updated it using FlowBoost FB Counter module, and that was just done with a tiny little 2-liner here. Ooh, it's a tiny little 2-liner to increment the webinar counter. Is just setting the counter name. Here I'm using the program ID as the counter name because we imagine you have different registrant limits per program, just a safe assumption, I think. And then we auto add someone to the counter name. Simple as that. And then you got that counter shared by everyone. Everybody who passes through the webhook updates that same shared counter, get this current thing. So let your mind wander with that. That's really the cool thing about FB Counter, is not just the webinar thing, but you think about all the things you wish you could count across leads. All the things you wish leads could know about each other. And that's where that awesomeness comes in. All right, 3:20. Well, okay, that's 20 minutes. I'm still here, by the way, but I am going to stop talking and just respond to this.
I am fascinated by this. I hope that everybody goes out and gets the community edition of this just to play around with it. We are going to have that follow-up webinar on November 10th. So we'll be able to get even deeper into this and, you know, go out, experiment, play with FlowBoost, and then on the 10th, come back and we can hear about, you know, your experience, what you've created, things that you've built, or if you've got something that you need to build. We'll have time on the 10th to kind of talk about what that code
Yeah,
would look like and where to find
sure.
that. So look for a follow-up coming out. We will do a follow-up email that's got information about, you know, also things like info, js.info, you know, places you can find JavaScript and code. We'll have a recording of today's webinar and also, yeah, links for all those upcoming things, upcoming events here at Atumos, and specifically that one coming up on the 10th after you've had a chance to play around with Community Edition. So on behalf of myself here at Atumos and Sanford Whiteman, round of applause, virtual applause for an awesome presentation on what is possible once you kind of empower those flow steps through FlowBoost. Awesome. So thanks again for all of our attendees. I'm going to go ahead and close the meeting out now. But again, if you have any follow-up questions, you can contact us at Atumos. You can email
Yes,
me.
do that.
So reach out if you have any questions. I should also mention MOPS Pros, our Slack channel. If you're not a member of MOPS Pros, that's a great place for resources, not just around FlowBoost and you know, what we've talked about here today, but also all kinds of Marketo advice. So check out MOPS Pros as well. You can get a hold of us there. So, all right. I hope everybody has a great afternoon, and we will see you all on the 10th, I'm sure.
Thanks, everyone.